Are you up to answer some more questions?
Answer more questions?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm Amol, that's his cousin. I'm Muslim, obviously, but I just have some questions about Islam. So, I think you probably get asked this often, but like I've never had an explanation that makes sense to me. But in Surah Nisa, like verse 34, when it says that like men can strike their wives, I was just wondering like an explanation that you have or an interpretation of that verse. Yeah, and why God had written that in the
Okay. When it comes to, for example, that particular verse, can you read it out, the whole verse?
In English? So men are in charge of women by right.
Can I have some of your water if you don't mind?
For the honor and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are really obedient, guarding in the husband's absence, what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted and grand.
Okay. Now, what would a feminist say to that?
Feminists, like that men shouldn't beat their wives.
Yeah. Under any circumstances, they would say. Okay. And what does, if you look into the actual explanation of this verse, and you look into the explanation of what scholars say, they would say there are conditions in which a man is allowed to hit his wife, if this thing is followed. In 1400 years of Islamic history, this thing has been discussed. No one can deny this is in the Quran. Okay? Now, the most direct explanation that someone would give of this is, if a woman is involved in behavior that is XYZ, then so-and-so Islamic scholar has said that he's allowed to hit her with what's like a miswak or something, right? Any feminist would say this is misogynistic, this is wrong, this is not allowed. When you carry on reading Surah Nisa and you read the other verses and you read the other verses in the Quran about women, it will say a woman gets half the inheritance a man gets. This coupled with a woman getting half the inheritance that a man gets, again, what would they say? They would say Islam is a misogynistic religion, it's a patriarchal religion. When you combine that with the idea that in Islam a woman has to wear a hijab but a man doesn't, what would their answer to that be? That would be, again, this is oppressive. If we carry on along this, we can come across maybe 7-8 things like this. I want to answer all of them in one go rather than one particular one. Islam says certain things which go against what men want and what women want. In both cases, the question that we have to ask is, why is Islam true? Because in Islam, one of the things which men love to do, for example, is business. You're not allowed to take interest. The most precious thing to wear is gold. Men are not allowed to wear it. When you're married, the man has to spend his wealth on the woman, but the woman can take her wealth and not spend it on the man. When it comes to silk, which is the best cloth, a man can't wear it, but a woman can. When there's a war going on, like there is in Ukraine, when there is a war and the Khalifa says you have to go to war, all the men have to fight, and if they die, they die, but the women don't have to fight.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off,
Yeah.
but like I have no issue with believing that Islam is true, and so my specific question is just that interpretation of the verse. Like, are men actually allowed to beat their wives? Like, Islam, is that okay?
Yeah. According to that verse, according to the interpretation for the last 1400 years, even the most liberal scholar will say that is something undeniable in the Quran. They will say even with a miswak, but no one will say that doesn't exist. No one will. And any Muslim that tries to sugarcoat it and say this verse doesn't mean that, they're going to do mental gymnastics and they're never going to come to a conclusion. The reason why I couple this with a whole bunch of other things is they're all related to fundamentally the question, is Islam true? Because what's worse, having to die and possibly be tortured by your enemies, or a man hitting his wife with a miswak? What's actually physically worse? Okay, no, sorry, let me just answer this. What's actually worse?
I mean, I just think those are very different circumstances that you can't like.
No, okay, what situation would you rather be in? I'm just talking about in terms of unfairness, because the root cause of these questions is there's something unfair in the text. That's the root cause, right? But the same unfairness can be applied to the man who says, I have to go to beyond the enemy lines and fight and possibly be captured and tortured, which is far worse than being hit by a miswak. So in Islam...
But you said that's the most liberal interpretation, so what's the more strict one?
Okay.
The general point he was trying to make.
I know, but I'm...
So what I mean by...
I understand your point, but I'm just
what I mean by liberal is not woke liberalism, because woke liberals will say that that's metaphorical, it doesn't exist. What I mean is, no one can deny that that's in the Quran.
Yeah.
No one can deny that's in the Quran. No one can deny for 1400 years, Islamic scholars have said this rule exists. No one can deny that. That's what I actually meant. And the reason why I coupled this with a whole bunch of other things is to show there are things in Islam which cannot be rationalized unless you look into why Islam is true. Because you have a problem with this, do you also have a problem with a woman getting half the inheritance that a man gets?
Well, I think that's different because, like, men are required to provide for their family, so that makes sense to me.
But that doesn't make sense to a whole bunch of other women.
Yeah, well, I'm like that. Because they don't understand the larger context. But I don't know. Like, to me.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
Like, that actually seems fair to me. Like, if men are required to provide for their family.
Okay, so let me ask you another way. If the Quran said that a woman, if her husband doesn't do X, Y, Z, and say the husband's involved in extramarital affairs, he does this or that, the woman's allowed to hit the husband, and the woman gets double the inheritance that a man gets. Would you accept that that is right? If it says that in the Quran, if it's the other way around.
I mean, so I have no issue with accepting that that's right. That's what I'm like. I have no issue with accepting that's right. I'm just wondering, like, what that actually means.
All right, can I just...
You know?
Okay, no, sorry, let me just complete this point. The point I'm trying to get to, sister, is that the ultimate reason why any Muslim should accept those verses or any other verses is because they believe it's from God, not because they can rationalize it. Because there are many things in Islam which are rational but cannot be rationalized. Okay? So for example, in Islam, alcohol is not permitted. Interest is not permitted. We believe behind every ruling in Islam there is a rationale, there is a wisdom. Now you've come to terms with the idea that women get half the inheritance of men because you've discovered the wisdom of it or you believe in the wisdom of it.
Yeah.
In Islam, Allah tells us behind everything that He legislates there is a wisdom. Sometimes we have access to the wisdom, sometimes we don't have access to the wisdom. The point is we have to submit if we believe Islam to be true. Certain things cannot be rationalized. Sorry, let me just finish this conversation first. The point I'm trying to get to is certain things in Islam cannot be rationalized. You have to go back into why Islam is true.
Okay. Yeah. I get all of that. I'm just wondering specifically about that verse, like how, like you said, the most liberal interpretation is like, okay, like men can beat their wives in miswak, but like, how extreme does it go? Like, how much can they beat their wives and have it be? Oh, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sister, listen, look.
Yeah.
Look, what do you mean meant by even the most liberal interpretation is that you can't deny it. And Subboor is very unapologetic about it.
Yes.
We're not trying to try and sugarcoat it
Yeah.
and say, oh, look, it doesn't really exist or this or that. But you know, there's some context here. I understand what you're saying. That look, you're a Muslim, you believe in Islam, you understand what. And Subboor pointed out there are wisdoms behind certain things, and there's contexts that we don't fully always understand. Just let me just add one thing to this. The context around even these verses being revealed, the Arabs before that used to beat their wives without mercy. Initially, it was forbidden, totally. And what happened was that because it went totally 180, then a lot of the people complained that...
How did it go totally 180?
By saying, first they used to, you have to understand, women's rights didn't exist before in Islam, before Islam came along, right? Even in inheritance. You know, when Muslim women were allowed to inherit half, a lot of people mocked Muslims. A lot of people mocked Muslims. Well, you're giving your women inheritance rights, things like that, right? With the beating verse, I want to be very specific and address this very specifically. Initially, the Arabs would beat their wives very aggressively, mercifully, and Islam came and said, no, that's wrong. But what happened is in a society that's so used to that, where the men were so dominant in that way that a lot of people complained that, hang on a minute, the women are going the other extreme now. They're taking full advantage and they're not able to manage and govern and so on. So when these verses came in, it came as a way to moderate. And when the beating of the miswak means that it's something so small and meaningless, it reduced it down, but there was always a threat there, or some sort of threat. Like slavery. Islam doesn't say it's good, right? But it didn't outlaw it straight away. What happened? It discouraged it. And over time, what happened? It went, right? So there are certain wisdoms in the way that Islam came about. It's very practical.
Yeah.
Even with alcohol, it was phased over time. This is just to finish this point, that this is the context of where these verses came about. You have to remember, look in history, why these verses were revealed, in what context were they revealed. Even now, in a lot of societies, where we spend a lot of time just now debating a guy who is promoting matriarchy and how women are on top and men should be subservient to them. But all of these things, if you think about it, in most cultures, and most of the cultures we come from as well, you as women would not respect a man unless he's a man. So there's a lot of different contexts to speak about, and these verses were revealed in that particular context.
And I want you to add something. The one who the Quran was revealed to understood it better than anyone, which is the Prophet. How many times did he beat his wives? Never. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, the best of you are the best to their wives. Why was the criteria to be the best human being, the best to your wife? Because you can act really nice in front of society, you can act really nice in front of your friends and family, but your real character is only known by your spouse. So Islam doesn't say wife beating's good and do it. This particular verse is for extreme circumstances. The Prophet, peace be upon him, never did it. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he had a woman come to him and the woman wanted to inquire about marriage proposals that she had, the Prophet discouraged her from marrying this guy because he was stingy, this guy because he's a wife beater. So Islam doesn't encourage wife beating, Islam doesn't encourage violence against women. This particular verse has to be understood in that context. And the way I see it is, this particular verse, for most women, I think for most men, even liberal men, not men in the past, but liberal men today, it cannot be rationalized. It simply has to be accepted if they go back to where it came from and they look at the context of it. Because there's many things in Islam, sisters, not just this, there's many things in Islam which can make someone leave Islam unless they go back to why Islam is true. So I'll tell you the story of one of my friends. One of my friends converted to Islam and he came from an egalitarian background, a liberal background. He found out that in Islam a woman cannot seek divorce. She can only get khula. She can't say talaq, talaq, talaq and get rid of her husband like the man can. There's an asymmetry there. And what happened was, this made him doubt Islam because he's a convert and he was brought up in a liberal feministic sort of way. After marriage he discovered, actually I see a wisdom behind this. Whatever wisdom he discovered, he discovered. So sometimes these things are tests from Allah. They actually test from Allah to see whether we believe. And this is why the question always goes back to, why is Islam true? What did I do with the guy who's here before you? I'm not interested in all the questions that he has. I'm interested in showing him why God exists and why Quran is true. Because once we can know that Islam is true, it answers all these questions.